Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I'm Anwesha, your host for today, and I have my colleague Adya with me. Adya researches advanced military technologies at Takshashila. Thank you so much for joining us, Adya.
Of course, happy to be here.
Yeah, today we will unpack the latest edition of India's Technology Perspective Capability Roadmap, or the TPCR, and consider its significance for defense procurement, industry, and modern military capability. So, Adya, just to set things off and to provide a bit of context, could you tell us a bit about what the TPCR is, what role does it play in defense procurement, and overall, how significant is it for the defense and manufacturing sectors?
Sure, okay. So, the Technologies Perspective and Capability Roadmap, or the TPCR, is this document that gets published by the Ministry of Defense. So the version that came out of it this year is the third iteration, and the previous versions were in 2013 and 2018. Essentially, the TPCR is supposed to outline the projected technological needs of the Indian Army, Navy, and Air Force for the next 15 years. And I think based on feedback from industry on the last couple of versions, the Ministry of Defense has decided to put out another version this year. It's sort of like, you can think of it as a guidebook for the domestic defense and manufacturing industry, and it provides them with a clear understanding of what the armed forces' future needs are likely to be. So this then allows them to align their R&D, their development, their manufacturing effort to try and tailor them to those specific requirements. So an important thing that's I'll point out here is that the TPCR is not a formal procurement list. So it's not like they're placing orders and publicly listing out the different things they've asked from different vendors from. It offers clues into the technologies and capabilities that they consider vital for future conflicts, but they're not formally asking for these things. It's not like an order's been placed. It's primarily to bridge the information gap between the military and the industry, and to sort of foster a more collaborative and targeted approach to defense indigenization, which has become increasingly important to India's various establishments over the last several years now. And so if you think about it, what role does it play? For the defense and manufacturing industry, the TPCR is like a huge resource because it provides them with vision, which allows them to make informed investment decisions and plan their own roadmaps and build their production capabilities in areas where they will also have orders placed from the government. So it'll be lucrative and will also at the same time be of like significant strategic importance to the nation. So by virtue of offering a degree of predictability, the TPCR sort of encourages the private sector participation, including MSMEs and startups in the defense sector. And considering that this sector largely has been historically dominated by public sector undertakings, this step is designed to sort of try and involve the private sector more, to try and connect them with the armed forces more, and hope that there'll be more orders from these companies. And this is, of course, all driven by this push towards self-reliance, which is a key theme in all three of the TPCRs that have come out, which have been driven by reducing foreign dependence on foreign suppliers and mitigating many of the risks that have been associated with technology denial regimes and most recently with supply chain vulnerability.
That's quite interesting.
So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. That provides quite a lot of helpful context as to the role that this particular document plays within the defense and manufacturing sectors. And I think we'll all agree that defense, national security, these are all very critical sectors, and so the fact that there exists something of this sort to help the market and the industry to sort of guide how they help in procurement for this particular industry. That's quite interesting. Now, before we delve into the broader sort of significance and the more meta view around what role this roadmap plays or has played in the past, perhaps we could delve a bit into the details of the document and what exactly the recent 2025 TPCR covers, and then we can sort of talk about the evolution of the three versions of the TPCR over time.
Okay, great. So the 2025 TPCR is interesting because a lot of the things you'll see in this document, you can see are almost like noticeable learnings from many of the conflicts that have played out in the world recently. The 2025 version is very comprehensive and it details a lot of the anticipated requirements across many, many spectrums of hardware and tech. It's structured with separate sections for the Indian Army, the Indian Navy, the Indian Air Force, and there's also a section on joint entries, which highlights requirements and needs that are common to all three services. And I think that's an important point to note because some of the technologies that are mentioned, not the particular weapon systems or whatever, but a lot of the underlying technologies that are mentioned will feature in individual sections as well as in the joint entry section. So within each service specific section, the document is further divided into like separate domains. For example, the Army's requirements and are sort of covering areas like armored fighting vehicles and systems, remotely piloted aircrafts and systems, weapons and systems, missiles and systems, ammunitions, sensors, EW and communications, and you can see that they've sort of identified these broader areas under which they can provide you with more granular ideas of their requirements. And for each of those, the sections detail their specific needs. Like for the Navy and the Air Force, they're highlighting things like ships and submarines, naval weapon systems, fighter aircraft, satellite-based applications, all of that. And then it provides more granular details for the listed items, such as like the life cycle of the equipment, the approximate quantities needed, the parameters or the particular preferred technologies. For example, the Army says a future-ready combat vehicle. They list out some capabilities that they think would be useful, like human machine teaming, net centric warfare, things like that. So you can almost think of it as like a very, very detailed wish list, if that helps. And the 2025 version of the TPCR it's almost like with every version, it gets more and more granular and more detailed.
Thank you. That's quite helpful in understanding, the various areas that this particular roadmap, or as you mentioned, wish list covers. Now, to perhaps delve a bit deeper into the different sort of technologies and emerging technologies and the sort of role that we see such technologies play in the future within the defense and overall, procurement. So as you mentioned, this sort of roadmap, it indicates where the defense places its priority. And so, in that case, what are the different sort of emerging technologies that you saw within this document, and sort of which technologies or use cases have you seen higher up in the priority?
In terms of technologies that are higher up in terms of priority, so most emerging technologies such as AI have suddenly become front and center to India's defense modernization plan. And the TPCR, this edition of the TPCR, sort of leaves zero doubt about how central they've become. It talks about AI, ML, cyber, space, things that were sort of, passingly mentioned in the first TPCR as now foundational elements of modern warfare, which is very interesting to see. And based on the way listings have been done in this edition of the TPCR, you can sort of gauge what the hierarchy of the priorities look like. So within these areas, unmanned systems and counter unmanned systems have emerged as something that's really, really important to the Indian Armed Forces in the coming years, at least. It's anticipated to, I think, be very central to warfare. The number and variety of unmanned systems that have been listed across all three services, along with dedicated counter UAS, counter unmanned aerial systems requirements, seem to indicate that this is a huge priority. It calls for everything from tactical drones for surveillance to advanced stealth unmanned aerial vehicles for precision strikes and loyal wingman roles. Then, of course, there's AI and machine learning, which are sort of envisioned to be integrated across many, many applications. This also, you can see, the kind of use cases have become vastly more detailed and developed and just like much more creative than the past few versions. And you can see it's almost like a direct takeaway from what's happening in the world today. So when it comes to AI and ML, there's many, many use cases such as AI enabled target recognitions, predictive maintenance for military platforms using AI, also AI based data fusion for enhanced situational awareness, and of course, autonomous navigation for unmanned vehicles, which is already becoming a reality today. Then cyber warfare and security have become really important. There's a huge section on IT and cybersecurity tools. And they've talked about things like the need for a zero trust network access model, as well as cyber defense for satellites, which again also highlights the importance of securing India's digital military infrastructure and developing offensive cyber capabilities, but also talks about the importance of space based assets. So, TPCR talks about the need for robust and resilient space infrastructure for ISR, and of course communication, navigation, all of that, and goes into a fair amount of detail as to what would be needed in the next couple of decades. They talk about the need for communication satellites and also technologies for the servicing of satellites while they're in orbit, which sort of, in my opinion, seems to underscore just what the importance of this domain has become to India today. Then, of course, finally, electronic warfare has become really, really important. And the document talks about many, many, many systems and many, many counter systems, from electronic warfare systems and jammers and electronic denial bubbles, and of course, advanced sensors and signature management technologies, all of that. And yeah, I guess dominating the electromagnetic spectrum has become really important to modern warfare today. And I think those broadly are the priorities: electronic warfare, space, cybersecurity, AI, ML, and unmanned systems.
Interesting. So maybe to just to pick your brain on this, I see that you mentioned AI and ML for maintenance, maintaining the existing infrastructure and all of that. I think that's quite a welcome move in the sense that when we talk about AI, we do think about what are safe use cases, what are relatively risky use cases. And so using AI for simplifying operational tasks per se, I think is quite a welcome move, and it's good that some things like these are higher up on priority. Obviously, cybersecurity and electronic warfare; these are things we sort of anticipated, and it's sort of, as you mentioned, it follows the global trend of things. Um, but do you see any particular use case or even broader sort of technology and the way in which it is being implemented as being concerning, or do you overall see that the sort of technologies and use cases that are mentioned are overall, relatively safe in the sense of, risk of misuse is less? So what's your opinion on the types of use cases and whether or not they are high risk, low risk, or uh, aims to sort of ease the operational tasks of the defense forces? Obviously, just to clarify, when I say low risk, I mean that the risk of misuse is less.
Okay, I had a feeling you'd ask me this because the moment you talk about emerging technologies being integrated with something as critical as defense, you can see that there's, of course, tremendous potential, but there's so many ways in which things can go wrong. I'll try and give you both sides of the picture. So, of course, the benefits of integrating these technologies are many, many, many fold. If you had AI enhanced systems, there'd be enhanced situational awareness. AI powered data and advanced sensor networks can provide people commanders with a much more comprehensive and real-time understanding of the battlefield. Then there's other positives, such as the fact that unmanned systems and precision-guided munitions with very, very advanced targeting capabilities can then minimize the collateral damage and increase the effectiveness of military operations, while also allowing us to mitigate the risk of having our own fighter pilots or human actors in the lurch and in dangerous combat situations. Then, of course, unmanned systems can also sort of improve force protection. Um, like I said, with fighter pilots, especially for things like mine clearance and reconnaissance, a lot of human soldiers are on the ground in dangerous environments. And this is also something where unmanned systems could be useful. And finally, of course, there's information dominance would be another huge plus if our cyber capabilities were to be developed. And, we'd have very robust cyber and space capabilities that could provide a lot of advantage in modern information-centric warfare. But like you said, there are so many concerns. I'll tell you some of the concerns I have. Firstly, of course, there's a huge host of ethical and legal implications. There's the development and deployment of autonomous weapon systems raise very complex ethical questions about how central the role of human control should be in life and death decisions. And I think here it's really important to have clear doctrines and very intentional international legal frameworks to govern the use of these systems, because otherwise there's so many ways that things can go wrong. But at the end of the day, I feel like armed forces do want to be accountable. They do want to know, they do want to have a clear chain of command. So if something goes wrong, you're able to explain it to the public and also understand and mitigate the risks that you'd have to bear and the costs that you'd have to bear. So hopefully if we do develop and acquire these systems, then that'll be something that becomes priority. Then another thing that I feel is we can also have technological dependence and vulnerabilities, because also the TPCR says a lot about indigenization and the development of cutting edge tech and all of that. Many of these areas do involve collaboration with foreign partners, and you do need some imported components, especially with where we're at today. India, I think, is catching up and striving to keep pace with the technological developments worldwide. And in some areas, we've gotten there, but in some areas, I don't think we have. And I think having advanced technologies, especially sensitive advanced technologies, can create new dependencies and vulnerabilities to supply chain disruptions or cyber attacks. Then another concern that I had, which is not really a risk, but is an issue that could crop up in the next couple of years, is if we do try to develop all these technologies, the technologies listed in the TPCR, they're very capital intensive. And the MOD will have to do something to ensure that there's adequate, sustained funding for R&D and procurement in these areas. Because otherwise, again, it's going to be like a lot of where we are with our defense infrastructure today, where we're almost keeping pace, but not quite. And with technologies like AI, ML, that are so rapidly evolving today, the pace of development and the skill gap can become very big. So again, we also need to figure out how to keep updating our military doctrines, and training and skill sets need to be constantly updated, because otherwise there can be this huge gap between the technologies available and the ability of people to utilize and implement it effectively as well. And then with the implementation and utilization issues, we also have risks of error, right? And we've all heard horror stories of systems like Lavender and Daddy that Israel used, where human operators are supposedly in the loop, but the safeguards aren't really particularly strong, and I get it. If the operator doesn't really understand the implications also, they will press a button that okays any command for whatever AI agent is selecting targets, and you can see what kind of things could happen with, both not having international frameworks that govern these things, as well as people just not being trained and not knowing how to implement safeguards and all of that. The final issue that I think is concerning is that the increasing reliance on warfare that's data-driven raises a lot of concerns about the security and privacy of sensitive military and personal information. And data security, once again, becomes front and center. And I think I've already been wondering this about the United States. I've read about many supposedly tech companies who made a lot of noise in Silicon Valley in the last 5 to 10 years about how military applications of AI were really unethical and all that. So many of them now has signed up with the Department of Defense. They've signed up with the army. And I do have questions about what data is being used, the security of the data, and just how it's being utilized and the privacy of that. So, yeah, those are some of the concerns I have. I'm sorry if this paints a very negative picture, but of course, with any new technologies, there will be a new set of challenges.
Yeah, no, I think you've touched upon pretty much everything that I was thinking about. And I think there's enough to discuss there for a couple more podcast episodes. And yeah, I mean, it's quite, it's good that we raise these concerns early on. We're still in the relatively early phases of not just artificial intelligence, but, other emerging technologies. And it's critical that these concerns and possible risks are raised early on, so that we have the time to develop adequate safeguards before anything catastrophic happens. We have seen certain catastrophic things happen around the use of these technologies, and I think that's a sort of wake up call for India particularly, but also overall in the world, to have safeguards and really think about the way in which these technologies are being developed and the sort of use cases in which they're being deployed. And so thank you so much for that. And just to perhaps, conclude this podcast, I'd like to, pose a final question to you, as in, do you think the TPCR provides a comprehensive roadmap, or do you think there are certain gaps that need to be filled, bridged, or yeah, overall, what is your opinion in terms of how the defense and manufacturing industry can utilize the TPCR?
Okay. So this is something that I also have questions about, but I'll try my best to answer this. I think the TPCR is a significant step forward in the right direction. It provides comprehensive, detailed ideas for what the Indian defense ecosystem needs, and I think putting that forward to industry would be really helpful. Also, the fact that its approach is granular, the articulation of the requirements is clear, and there's also a long-term perspective, helps a level of clarity that was missing in the last two editions of the TPCR, which were not, nearly as comprehensive. The first edition actually was pretty vague if you look at it compared to this. Another positive of the TPCR in being useful for industry is the dedicated section on the joint requirements of the forces, which is particularly welcoming because it also encourages a more integrated approach to defense manufacturing in India. However, I will say is it's a roadmap. While it puts forward things, it puts forward these requirements and emphasize on emerging technologies, and we know that there's an impetus for innovation research in these areas. It is just a roadmap, and I think how further action takes place is what is important. For example, while the TPCR lists a vast array of requirements, maybe in actual communication with the industries when orders are being placed, the fact that there will be more clearer indication of the priority and indicative timelines for procurement and all of that would, of course, help with better planning. But some of these issues, are obviously explained by the fact that this is a roadmap. This is not explaining how procurement is really going to happen. It's not a list of orders. Another area that I think perhaps is a hurdle to the implementation and needs to be figured out for this to be beneficial for industry as well is, like it was mentioned, I think in the 2013 analysis of the TPCR, like a lack of firm financial commitment, for lack of a better word, from the government can be a huge deterrent for private investment. I mean, why are companies going to say, hey, we will invest in this particular long-term product for you, where there's no firm commitment? And I think while the government has shown a strong commitment to defense modernization, clear and long-term funding assurances for projects in the TPCR would, of course, boost industry confidence for sure. Then, while the TPCR, it outlines the what and the how of defense. While it outlines the requirements, the what and the how of defense procurement are very complicated. And I think if the defense acquisition procedure, the DAP, would be streamlined and simplified, I think it would help to ensure that the technologies in the TPCR are inducted in a much more timely manner. And finally, the one thing that I have to say about its effectiveness and its usefulness for the industry and the government, if there's one thing the TPCR does right, in my opinion, is it emphasizes the need for collaboration between the public and private sectors. And I really think this is one of the biggest hurdles that the Indian defense sector has had so far. Historically, we have PSUs which have done so much, and for a lot of startups who don't have funding, they're not going to mass produce rather technologies without assurance of funding, without proper communication, without simplified procedures. And to have an actual vibrant defense ecosystem which will have collaboration between the public and private sectors, I think it needs to be much more proactive when it comes to fostering partnerships between the DRDO and large players, MSMEs, academic institutions for that matter, research institutions who understand the technologies and can then collaborate with startups for the production. So yeah, I guess the TPCR is forward looking, it is comprehensive, but to me, the success of it will depend on, and the effectiveness of it will depend on if the execution is timely and if the vision it supposedly lays out is backed by political will, if it's backed by funding, and if it's also backed by a proper streamlined procurement process that also listens to the private sector and listens to startups. So yeah, hopefully, I think in the next decade or so, India definitely needs to amp up its defense expenditure and defense production, try and keep up with technological change across the world. And we have to see how that'll play out. So only time will tell.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Adya. I think that was a very detailed conversation around, this one particular roadmap and its previous iterations. I think we are on somewhat of a positive path to defense, procurement and overall how we're looking at emerging technologies for the defense. There are definitely things to be done, things to be worked on. But I think overall, this was quite a positive note to end on. And for our audience, we have launched the latest China Challenge survey. Do engage with the survey and sort of play a role in the way in which we do our analyses of not just India's security landscape, but India's relationship with China, and other aspects as well. With that, we will end this podcast. Thank you so much, Adya, and thank you to the audience for listening in.
Thank you for having me, and yeah, that was fun.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.